Seminar of the semester. Welcome back to school. I am Teresa Osabak, the MPC director. I am so happy to see you all and welcome to everybody who's online. I cannot see you. So a reminder that the full semester seminar and workshop schedules can be found on our websites, the LCC and MPC websites. First of all, welcome to our Institute trainees. We're welcoming several new trainees this year into the Population Studies and Population Health branch programs. Welcome to our two interdisciplinary doctoral fellows. Isabel is with the LCC and Nora is with the MPC. Can you raise your hand if hello? All right. Check out the new Izzardy training wall just outside these doors here, the little blue signs for all the info on our trainees, new and existing. And last but certainly not least, I want to hear congratulations to Sarah Flood and Jeanette Dill on the new 5-year renewal of the NIA-funded Life Course Center. That funding just started last week, so excellent job. All right, I'm so excited that Dr. Megan Gunnar is here. She is a Regents Professor and Distinguished McKnight University Professor at the Institute of Child Development here at the U of M. Professor Gunnar has spent her career studying how stress biology affects neurobehavioral development and the processes that help children regulate stress hormones. Here is the coveted mug that you can only receive if you present in our seminar series. So congratulations. Here you go.
Right size. Those little tiny cups need a big one.
So thank you so much, and we look forward to your talk today, Dr. Gunnar.
Well, it is a delight to be invited over here. I'm going to give a talk that is probably a little different than what you all hear normally, but that's good because you'll pay attention. It'll be new information. So I'm going to talk about the early effects or early life deprivation and later development. Really talking a bit more in some ways to for the life course people who are interested in how early and later things connect. And I'm going to focus on the part of my research that deals with children who have been adopted internationally from orphanage-like institutions in the first few years of their life. In other words, very early. Now, Coles to Newcastle, you all know about the social determinants of health. That's like your bread and butter, and our dear friend Michael Marmot and the amazing Whitehall studies that got all this started. So that's life course, social determinants of health. But then we get the ACEs work, and our friend Falidi sort of focusing in on, gee, the things that are happening in childhood are important, up to 18 years of age. And that's what ACEs are about. Okay, to me, 18 is like, oh, so old. Oh my goodness, so old. They might even leave home at that point. Then there's the work on maybe you don't know as much about is the emphasis on the first 1,000 days from conception through age 2 or 3. These days are sort of in quotes with the importance of nutrition. That's what they started with, but now recognizing the importance of socio-emotional care and all, what you're breathing in your air the first 1,000 days as your biological systems are getting set up. And of course, that's not a surprise to any developmentalist because we've been talking about the importance of the attachment relationship to children in the first few years of life for a very long period of time. The challenge we have in trying to understand what effects early experiences have, especially experience of deprivation and adversity, is it's really hard to isolate those first few years because the nature of life is that if adverse things are happening to you early in life, that tends to predict what's going to happen to you as you develop. You're going to accumulate more ACEs up to 18, and then your social status is, it's the whole schmear. It's really hard. And I joke to say that nature would never get a PhD because she designs really lousy natural experiments. Everything is confounded with everything else. And particularly, it's really hard to isolate a particular period of development because usually things don't change that much. You might go from a fairly decent thing to having war hit you. So it's a little easier to go from a reasonable life to some disaster, a natural disaster or war, but really hard to find kids who go from really awful early to really great later and do so at a time that really you can demarcate, except for kids adopted from orphanage-like institutions. Now, because they go from something like that to something like that. Now, before I get into this, I really want to make it clear that I am not advocating for international adoption. There is a lot that is challenging about which white people coming in and taking poor brown and black and whatever kids and moving them to the United States. There's a lot of issues. And anytime people can make money on children, they do. And so we are now understanding that some of those children adopted from orphanages were not orphans. They were kids who had been taken from their families, surreptitiously placed in the orphanage by someone who sold them to the orphanage and then whatever. So not advocate. The best thing we can do, based on the data that I'll be talking about and others, is to advocate for finding better ways to take care of children who do not have permanent parents so they can stay in their countries of origin and grow up in a family and stabilize their families so that they don't have to abandon their children. And those are the right policies. Okay. On the other hand, I'm not advocating against it. So if you've adopted or have friends who have adopted internationally, it can be an amazing and wonderful thing. End of that part of the discussion. We went through in the West a period of amazing experiment from about 1990 when Ceausescu was shot in Romania to about 2006, where we in the West were adopting an incredible number of children internationally from orphanage-like institutions. At the highest point, it was close to 25,000 a year into the US. That's a lot of kids who had came in with early deprivation experiences, and most of them had been in institutions, and most of them were adopted by the time they were about 3 or 4 years of age. So this is early experiences of deprivation. Most of them had lived all their lives in institutional care. Some had been taken from abusive homes, but most had lived at least 90% of their time prior to adoption in an institution. And it is really hard to raise babies in institutions. It's hard to create the context that even the most sort of average family can do. We've known that since the 1960s, when people like Tazard and Hodges in England and others in the United States studied what happened to kids in institutions and were able to show not the best way to grow a brain or a healthy child. And in many Western countries, we moved to foster care for young children, which has its own issues, but was doing better than they could do in institutions. And then we had this whole sort of fall of the Iron Curtain and so forth and so on. And we began to get a number of studies. The English and Romanian adoption study, where they were studying kids adopted from Romania soon after Ceausescu's fall. The Bucharest Early Intervention Study, an amazing study, the only one we know of that involved random assignment out of institutional care. Ethical because there was no foster care in Romania at the time. And several years later, that study had encouraged them to develop a foster care system. Ceausescu had gotten rid of all of the social workers, all of the psychologists, and there was the belief that your kid would do better in an institution, and he wanted a lot of workers for his whatever. So anyway, that study was amazing, is the only one. And I'll be using some of the data from that. They randomly assigned and kept the kids in research supported foster care up to age 5. And they made the agreement they would never change. I mean, if the family wanted to get their kid back, it was fine. And there was a lot of movement around after age 5 because many of them did still go back to the institution. There was a Russian orphanage study by Bob McCall, studying 3 different orphanages in Russia that had different qualities or levels of support for the kids. And then my own international adoption project where we surveyed all of the families who had adopted over a 10-year period and then continued to add to that the list of people who were interested in doing research. So by the end of that, we had around 4,000 families. And we were able we did some longitudinal work, but we were also able to just sample out of that so we could do more intensive in-depth studies When you do longitudinal work, everybody fights over, well, I want 3 questions to know whether the kid was securely attached because, yeah, we were able to do more in-depth work. All of that has basically concurred. The evidence is very similar across all of these studies about what are the challenges of kids who start out early in deprived conditions and then move into upper middle class, highly educated, highly responsive and supportive families. Um, what do we see for those kids? And the similarities are executive function deficits, uh, thing called indiscriminate friendliness, biology of stress is affected. That's how I got into this business. Those kids often have problems with peers for reasons that I'll explain. Increase in problems in adolescence. While that's true for all kids, adolescence, the best of times and the worst of times, these kids show more of them show a much bigger uptick in challenges in adolescence. And you may see an advancement in the biology of aging. So let's move quickly so I can get done. Sorry, guys, got a tickle. Executive functions. There are 3 general capacities that are thought of as part of our executive functions. The circuitry that's involved in this is throughout the prefrontal cortex, connecting with the limbic system. Your ability to shift and cognitive flexibility. So you're solving a problem one way and it's worked for a while, but now it doesn't. Are you able to step back and change what you do? Many of you have colleagues that you think suffer from a problem in this area. They're still using the same hammer. Um, Updating working memory, keeping in mind what you're doing. My kids can repeat this easily. My name is Megan. I'm standing in the kitchen now. Why did I come here? Right, because I was thinking about something else. My working memory wasn't updating. And the capacity to inhibit prepotent responses. Little kids love this. Red light, green light. Simon says, da da da. As adults, you're heading for the refrigerator. Whoops, I know I'm on a diet. Leave the refrigerator. And the overlapping of these, sorry, that's really bad. Attention and cognitive control, self-monitoring and planning that take several of these. So you can imagine that if you're not very good at these things, self-regulation is a challenge. Now we've been studying this, others have studied it. Uh, this is from a study that we call our transition into the family studies, but these kids were a year after adoption. They've been adopted when they were about a year and a half to 3 years of age. So a year later, they're 2.5 to 4 years of age. We used a number of tasks developed by my colleague, Stephanie Carlson, including the dimensional change card sort task. This has colors, animals of different colors, and we're going to sort by color. So put all the red here and they do that, and that's great. And now, okay, now we're going to play another game. Put all the horses here and the sparrows there, and they still sort by color, even though they can repeat. I'm supposed to put the horses here and the sparrows there, or whatever. So that's a challenge of executive function. Spin the pots. You put the stickers in different pots, you spin them on a lazy Susan, and I'll find the stickers. Can I remember where they update my working memory? And delay of gratification, your classic marshmallow task. And you can see that a year after adoption, there's no sex difference. But my non-adopted group, my kids born and raised in upper middle class families typically upper middle class families in Minnesota, score higher than my kids adopted into families that are identical to those. So as soon as we can look at it, but it doesn't go away. This is different group of kids, similar demographic, 8, 9 years of age. We gave a whole bunch of executive function tests. One thing here, these are our post-institutionalized kids, our previously institutionalized guys. These are our birth children. I always go changing the name of this group because I don't know. Everybody's got is a birth child. They were born from some, what do I call these people? If I say non-adopted, you think I left them in the institution. Anyways, challenge. These guys were adopted internationally from foster care because some of the effects of this could be disruption. You're just adopted internationally. And what you see is the PI kids, high as poor here, scored worse on everything except one of those tasks. And I'm not going to tell you what all the tasks are. So years after adoption, 6 years, they're still struggling with this. We have also tried to look at what's happening in the brain. while they solved these problems. Yet another group of kids, these were 9 to 11, we gave them a flanker task. All the arrows, you're supposed to respond to which direction the middle arrow is, and it's flanked by arrows that are either go the same way or the opposite way. And it's harder, of course, if the flanking arrows go the opposite way. And go, no go, it's the adult version of Simon Says or red light, green light. But for every letter except, right? They do it as fast and as accurately. And what you can see is the foster kids from foster care are pretty close to the non-adopted kids, maybe more so on the go, no go than on the flanker. The N2 is a negative component in the electrical, the event-related potential wave, and it's associated with paying attention. The ERN is the error-related negativity that comes a little later if you've made a mistake. My friend Nathan Fox, who studies this stuff, calls it the oh shit response. Your brain say, whoops, I didn't do that right. And what you can see is these guys actually, well, no difference here, not, not significant here. They're in between, and those are my PI's kids. So at all levels that we look at, there's evidence that these kids struggle with these executive function capacities, right? When we, they require the prefrontal cortex, and when we and others image the brain, we're seeing very similar things. Now, we don't have your early adopted from foster care. These are PI kids adopted before 12 months. These are adopted after, between 12 months and 5 years, mostly by age 3. These are Minnesota kids born and raised in their families of origin, and this is the amount, this is the volume of prefrontal cortex. And what you're seeing, Teresa, over there, is the prefrontal cortex is not as big. And this is years after adoption. These are 11 to 14-year-olds. So that's early experience, even though theoretically adolescence to adulthood is when executive functions develop and the prefrontal cortex comes online. There's animal works that says that's crazy. That what things that are happening early influence the development of the prefrontal cortex. And when it's developing later, there's just not as much gray matter to be able to work with. Okay? So early experiences matter for the development of the regions of the brain that are involved in executive functions. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment relationships here because many people have probably, even people in population centers research, have probably heard that, boy, early attachment matters and your quality of your attachment to your parent matters. It sets you up for your relationships with others and so on as your life develops. But of course, it's not the end all and be all. You can have a horrible relationship with your mother and still marry and have a lovely relationship with a significant other, but you might need some therapy in between. So the idea in the 1930s and 40s was that if you didn't have someone to form an attachment with, by the time you were 2 or 3, you were toast. You'd never form an attachment to anybody. And that was really believed. Turns out to be absolutely wrong, sort of. So one of the things that's been a challenge is people have wanted to look at the quality of attachment of kids when they're in an institution to the person who they theoretically like the most. When we study kids who were born and raised with their parents, we can't find a kid who hasn't formed a fully formed attachment. It might be insecure, it might be disorganized, but they form an attachment. And so we didn't have a way of looking at whether they formed, how much of an attachment. It's not a concept. You're not more or less attached, you're different quality attached. So the group that did that Bucharest study had to develop a scale to look at whether the child actually had formed an attachment, whether you could score the quality of attachment. And for kids living in the institution, what they saw was, and there were quite a few of them in this study, and Betty Carlson, who's here at the U. I'm sorry, I'm not in your way. Oh, okay. All right. I moved the computer. About 10% that has showed no evidence, maybe some differentiation, preference, but it was pretty passive. Looked like they might have been attached, but with a clear, less than 5%. You should never be scoring kids in orphanages for on a because they haven't formed one that you can score. So in our adoption or transition into the family study, which was longitudinal, I said we looked at kids adopted between about 16 and 36 months. We assessed them as soon as we could catch them, 1 to 2 months after adoption. Again, at 8 months, 16 months, and 24. So we saw them 4 times in the first 2 years. And we assessed them again when they were 5 and in kindergarten. We did quite a few things, but one of the things we looked at with Betty was how fast do they form an attachment? 2 months after adoption, we didn't see any of those with scores of 1 or 2. All of them were showing some sign, and maybe 4 were attached, but with some anomalies. By 9 months, they all could be I mean, almost all of them could be classified. So these kids were pretty old at the time, and they were forming attachment. Yeah, we used a variant of that, and Betty scored it from that because now what I'm going to show you is how she classified them. And so the classifications were, and these kids are older than is typical for strange situation, but the not the born and raised in Minnesota, 90% of them were showing were looking secure. That's a little higher than usual, but then this is a really low risk sample of parents. Almost 70% of our PI kids were securely attached. They looked securely attached. Some disorganized, but for the most part, this is a very positive picture. Attachment is hard to beat out of a child. We need it so much. We need to organize our relationships around people. And these parents we've scored them. They're very sensitive and responsive, and the kids formed pretty secure attachment with them. Okay. Now, in the early studies, the one that was done in England with the kids out of Romania, there was all of this talk about, boy, a lot of attachment disorders. Oh my gosh, attachment disorders, all over the place, attachment disorders. But the type they showed was something called disinhibited. There are two forms of a reactive attachment disorder. Inhibited, you don't go to anybody. Disinhibited, you go to everybody. And they were showing this pattern of go to everybody, disinhibited attachment disorder. And it's the core of it is this thing we call indiscriminate friendliness. And it is weird. I mean, if you're around kids much, you understand that when you come to, and your baby can't move around, but when about give it another 10 months, you would walk in the room and I would come up and your baby would go to you and maybe look at me like that, right? Um, and then warm up maybe and be friendly, but would not walk over to me and go, mama, mama, mama. And that's what you see in many of these kids. They do this crazy thing. They want to be hugged and picked up. And it looks like an attachment disorder. And if they're raised with their parent, it is an attachment disorder. I remember walking in, our church was housing homeless families. I walked in, I was serving the evening meal. This little 4-year-old saw me. Wow, pick me up. I had never seen this kid before in my life. His mother was in the other room. She was a teenage mom, and an older lady was braiding her hair, and she was getting her needs. She was a child. She was getting her needs met, but she wasn't able to meet the needs of the child. So he was after getting his needs met, right? So it looks like an attachment disorder, but these kids, for the most part, are securely attached. And we see it co occurring in these children. They both are securely attached to the parent that they're with, and they're showing this indiscriminate kind of behavior. Um, and it does predict higher emotional and behavior problems later in development. But why are they showing it? We've traced the formation of this. There's a interview you can do when kids are older with the parents called the Disorders of Attachment interview, developed by Charlie Zena, who is in that other slide. And we've used that and classified kids as having what Charlie has renamed this disinhibited social engagement disorder and thinks of it as being potentially different from a reactive attachment disorder in some kids. And then we trace the development of their behavior towards strangers from the time they got here and so on. And what we saw is that we could begin to predict by about 8, 9 months after adoption which kids were going to go on to show the disorder. And the difference was that they certainly were much more verbally friendly, but they were also more physically friendly with a stranger. I have not met you before, and within moments, I'm sitting in your lap playing with the toy that you're showing me. There is no self respecting 2 or 3-year-old that will do that with a stranger um, until they know him better. What predicted that? In other work of ours and in other work, it's our friend at executive attention problems. The kids with more executive attention problems are the ones that are showing it. And in a way, it makes perfect sense. None of the behaviors those kids are engaging in is, is an inappropriate behavior. Cuddling, kissing, smiling, being friendly, all fine. It's just what we learn with development is who are our peeps and who do we show that behavior to and who do we inhibit it. And friendly kids, they're motivated to, but there's you know, and then there's always that child who at age 4 walks up to a strange lady and says, "Is that a baby in your tummy?" And the mother like dies because that's a perfectly appropriate question, maybe with your aunt, but not with a stranger. So we learn which behaviors to inhibit, and it's part of social development. And you have to have good executive functions to inhibit a prepotent response. And for these kids, it really is prepotent because they learn that's how to get your needs met in the orphanage, is to be friendly, to shine out, as my Southern mother-in-law would say, to shine out. So they have to engage in executive functions, and the ones who are good at it that show less of that behavior. Round and around, there's an executive function theme going on in my talk. Let me briefly talk about stress biology, which has been the bread and butter of my career. I have studied the activity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis since forever. Um, and but I was one of the first developmental psychologists to really study the system because you had to get blood. And I started with newborns getting blood as part of, the Godfrey exam in the newborn nursery. And then we got liberated when they developed assays in saliva. So I became the spit lady. And parents were fine, take all the spit you want, blah, blah, blah. Once it comes in, I mean, you got to get the parotid going. And anyway, I spent my career learning how the system is regulated in humans and then wanting to understand what happens when you don't have the critical regulator of the system. Because the critical regulator of the system early in life is the parent child, the adult child relationship, social relationships by age about 7, 8 months became the key regulators of this system, right? Under your stress biology is under social regulation, and over the course of development, you learn how to regulate your own. And ultimately, as we'll see with puberty, your parent gets booted out of your hypothalamus, and you're on your own. You got to regulate until you fall in love. But that's a whole other story. Good relationships, your spouse is pretty good at buffering you too. I first realized that we had a problem with this in kids who were in orphanage rear because when I was asked to go to Yash, Romania, and help collect spit from kids who were living in an orphanage in Yash, and they were 2-ish years of age, 2 to 3, and we collected saliva also from family reared kids who were in childcare. And the green line is what you would expect from a normal diurnal rhythm in cortisol. So Romanian kids had a normal rhythm in cortisol. There were like 46 of the kids that contributed to that red line. Not one of them had a normal diurnal rhythm. And a lot, I mean, it was low. I mean, the big problem is it wasn't significantly higher later, though it didn't come down as much, but it was way freaking low early in the morning when you're supposed to have it high. It's like your cup of coffee. It motivates you to go seek novelty and find carbohydrates. And, it's good. You need a nice response early in the morning. I called up my postdoctoral advisor, Gig Levine, and I said, Gig, the adrenal's not doing what it's supposed to. And he said, "Oh, yes, it is, Megan, but you don't understand it." I said, "A lot of help you are. Do you understand?" He says, "No, but it's doing what it's supposed to." This was one of the first pieces of evidence that then began to come in a lot that with chronic stress, the adrenal will often go down regulate and go hypo responsive. You hear about elevated cortisol, elevated cortisol. Your body can't tolerate that very long. And in fact, chronic elevations produce all sorts of really nasty symptoms. So there's a lot of biology that will unhook the central stress system and corticotropin releasing hormone and the amygdala, blah, 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 all the stuff that causes fear and anxiety from the production of cortisol at the adrenal level. And that ain't good because you need that to be activated to get the system back in track. But so we were seeing hypocort. Everybody was saying, I can't believe it. It had been seen earlier in PTSD. So they said all these kids had PTSD. I said, no, I don't think they really do. Um, but they certainly have sort of hypofunctioning of that adrenal system. So we looked at that in the transition into the family study, and our this thing we did with these kids lasted an hour and a half to 2 hours. And the latter part of it, we were slapping electrodes on their heads, and I mean, it was a long session. And our non-adopted kids were doing what they should. They were getting tired. They had to keep functioning. One of the It's called a glucocorticoid for a reason. Cortisol increases the available of sugar in the bloodstream, and they were probably their body said, need more energy. Okay, up we go. Not that they were fearful and anxious, but they needed more energy. Our PI kids, no, they didn't respond. They stayed flat. We had diurnal data on them. We had it over the first 2 years. We ran both their diurnal stuff and their response in the lab through using principal component analysis, get two components out of that. One is just low, flat, non-responsive cortisol, and the other was the response to coming to the lab, which didn't load. Created two scores. I told you we followed them into kindergarten. In kindergarten, the teachers reported on their internalizing problems, externalizing problems, and ADHD problems. ADHD, executive functions, big time. And controlling for sex, because of course boys have more externalizing and attention regulatory problems, probably because they could go to school a year later and be a little bit happier with the girls. Um, and the early adversity, hypocortisolism, was contributing to both of those, not to internalizing. The hypo went along at kindergarten with problems with externalizing, being aggressive, and problems with controlling and regulating your attention. Okay, one of the critical things for kids in whether they develop emotional problems and what happens if they have emotional problems is struggling with peer relations. Kids are happy when they have friends and when they are happy with their friends. And if it doesn't work out with friends, that is tough. Kids who have problems with prefrontal function often have problems with peers. Peer relations are complicated and they get more and more complicated as you get older. I was we had the preschool at the institute used to be downstairs. Now way over on the other side of campus. Used to be downstairs. And it's such a temptation when your kids are there. You go down, you watch through the one-way things, and it's just wonderful. With the second child, the first one was beating up on kids. It wasn't so good, but the second one was very nice. And I remember watching Pete. He was 3, and he had 2 really good friends in that class, Hunter and Juliet, and they're sitting at snack, and I'm looking right down on it. And Hunter says to Pete, "You're my friend, aren't you, Pete?" That's a big issue in preschool. Pete said, "Oh, yeah, I'm your friend." "Ooh," Juliet. "Pete, you're my friend, aren't you?" Pete goes, "Yeah, I'm your friend." And he's quiet. And all of a sudden he does, "One, two, three. I'm 3. I can't do 3. I can't do that, that, and that relation. It's too much." Right? It was a very wise thing for him to say. It was too complicated. As you get older, peer relations get even more complicated. When you adolescents, they're a nightmare. Who's talking to who's being friendly, who's really friendly, who's not, ugh, I hated that junior high. So sometimes what we see is these kids who struggle with prefrontal function are more aggressive, and that's the problem. But often they just have trouble negotiating the complexity of what's going on. And in fact, in that study where we observed the kids in preschool, we had the teacher report of peer problems. Orange is my PI kids, the Minnesota kids are the yellow. Attention regulation, which I've already told you about. By the way, we studied parenting quality over those first 2 years post adoption. We used the best scales. The highest point on that scale could be a 6. This is what I'm saying. They're getting really high quality parenting. Okay, so that's not the issue. But if we try to trace out what's predicting the peer problem, The hypocortisolism is related to the attention problem is predicting the peer problems when we control. So problems with attention regulation, executive function, they're all over the place, underlie many of the issues that we're seeing in previously institutionalized kids. And then we get to adolescence, the best of times and the worst of times. The things that we see is that there's a big uptick in especially internalizing problems in adolescence. And some of us believe that sort of the crux of this is that those cognitive and social cognitive deficits become much greater liabilities as you move into that adolescent period. And then, of course, many of these children are um, uh, interracial products of interracial adoption. And their parents are white and upper middle class and well educated and often in private school. So the kids are often around predominantly, at least earlier on. Now things are changing with many of those schools, but we're mostly around white kids. So you are a minority, your family often thinks that colorblind is the right thing. We now know that's terrible for the kids because they need to recognize they're an interracial family and they need to somehow get themselves educated, which is almost impossible for wealthy white people to understand what it's like to be a minority, what their kids might be experiencing. And the kids know their parents love them and want to do everything for them and don't want to come home and say, I'm having all these problems because it's like they're rejecting their parents. It's very complicated. Rich Lee's doing some great work on it here. Um, and as I said, developmental tasks change, intimacy, mature relationships, really complicated. And there's all those neurodevelopmental and hormonal changes with puberty, which we've gotten very interested in because cortisol's a steroid hormone. And also, of all of those sex hormones are steroid hormones, and their elevation affects something called binding globulins because nature does this crazy things. It produces all these hormones and it binds most of them to proteins so they can't do anything. It's sort of a quick reserve, but she's very generous in her scope. So some of the increase in the binding globulins could also be causing some relative increase in my favorite stress hormone. So we did a study because I began to wonder if this period of time, and there was some rat work suggesting it was true, might be another period where the system opens up and says, how harsh is that environment? Like it was doing early in development. The environment's harsh. I'm going to to be able to downregulate. But how harsh is that now? Because they were staying hypo all the way up to puberty. And I thought, well, maybe they will recalibrate. And we did a study. It was an accelerated longitudinal design. We did Tanner staging by nurses. Tanner staging tells you what stage of puberty. That is like the gold standard to do with nurses. We collected cortisol and some other hormones, which I'm not going to talk about. And we ran them through what's called the Trier social stress test because it was developed in Trier, Germany. Um, and it's a public speaking task. So you are told you're going to give a speech in front of judges. You've got 5 minutes to prep it. You're given a story stem for it. You prep the speech. You can't have any notes. You get up, you give it in front of these judges who are very neutral. They don't give you a clue whether it's, and they write notes. And you're being filmed. And you're being told that then it'll be shown to others, kids or adults of your age. And then after that, you do mental arithmetic and it's designed so you're going to make mistakes. And when you make a mistake, they tell you to start over. Okay? It's stressful. Social evaluation is the ethical stressor that we can use in the laboratory to activate the system. We are a social animal being rejected, being thought of as wanting, as in what's that wonderful movie about the sort? Anyway, um, you've been tried and tested and found wanting. Is really terrible, and it's very stressful for us as people. So it is the stressor test that is known to be used. Now, next slide, I want you to look on the right hand side first, because these are our non-adopted Garrison Keeler kids. Stage one, I'm going to stand over here. Actually, I shouldn't because guys online won't be able to see that, will they? Ah, don't do that. Um, so I don't know how to make a pointer point. Um, so if you look on the right hand side, it'll work. right, because I'm being videoed. Right, think I can do that. This solid line, these are the kids at stage one. They haven't started. They're mostly 7 and 8 years of age. And they come in a little higher and they just fall. That's not a stress response. It's like collapse. And then we start seeing a fairly typical but small response because they're kids by stage five. That looks like an adult. That's the end of, that's stage five of puberty. If I look on the other side, the shape looks similar, but low, it's really low court. That's the hypo court. And with each stage of puberty, and I saw them over 3 years. So this has been analyzed within subjects. As the stages of puberty increase, they're responding. And the response becomes like a typical kid. Okay, everybody is so excited. Me publishes this paper about recalibration. I say it's about the stress response, and everybody thinks, oh, everything's recalibrating. It's a wonderful period of time. And I'm going, don't you guys realize these kids show an increase in problems as they move into adolescence? And stress reactivity, cortisol, it should be increasing internalizing issues. So we've looked at that, and yeah, it is increasing internalizing problems. Within the scope of that study, and then we followed the kids up later. It was during COVID. Yeah, everybody's got problems. But we had the comparison group, and we saw that they had more problems with internalizing, more problems with emotion regulation, more problems with negative affectivity, the whole schmear that would go with that, and the ones who were showing more recalibration. Oh, so what's happening? Well, we think that initially that downregulation was an adaptive downregulation and it like gave them a Volkswagen stress system. And then with puberty, it's sort of like, hello, they got a Ferrari. I mean, they got a normal reactive stress system, and the brain had been adapted to a lower stress response. So now their systems are having to adapt to having just a lot more of stress reactivity going on in a brain that was not adapted for it. Now, whether they'll sort this out by the time they're adults, I don't know. And unfortunately, it's really hard to get money to follow them that long. And I'm retiring, guys. The last thing I want to talk about is physical health. So much of the things you guys are interested in, social determinants have to do with physical health, cardiometabolic disorders, et cetera, et cetera. What we know is often related to obesity. So the problem we're facing in this country is we're all fat, and kids got fatter at earlier ages, and heavy-set kids tend to have more problems with cardiovascular disease. Erin Kelly and others have been studying obese kids and their cardiometabolic health for a while. But my PI kids are not bad. They have the same kind of weight pattern or weights that whole food family kids have, right? My internationally adopted families, most of those, I mean, the problem with overweight and obesity tends to go along with the social determinants of health. And so many of the kids with that problem tend to be at lower socioeconomic. Not all of them, but many. And our PI kids just aren't showing an average increase in that. So working with Erin Kelly and others in pediatrics, we took kids who were growth stunted. That is, they were not, I mean, they're delayed in growth at adoption. And we compared them to his control groups that had the same BMI, healthy BMIs, as our internationally adopted kids. We are working on replicating this study now. Some of it is replicating, some of it is not as strong. But what we saw in that study, published in Pediatrics, is an increase in arterial stiffness, elevated cholesterol at fasting, elevated fasting insulin, and higher HOMA are insulin resistant. So, like they're on a trajectory, their body, even though it's not overweight, is acting older. And there's other people who are taking a look at epigenetic changes that may indicate. So the other final thing, and I will be done by 5 after, is we got really interested in the immune system, not just whether they have elevated um, hello, inflammation, which everybody suspects, and they do, by the way. But we got interested in the T cells because T cells are your critical disease fighting cells. and they're produced, and they have a life course. Hello, life course. You study T cells. T cells have a life course of their own, and they start out immature, and then they get turned into different kinds of cells, and they meet pathogens, and they learn to fight them, and they become more mature, and then you restore the memory of it. Ultimately, they get old, and they get to this terminally part where they're just sort of like the old soldiers that knew how to fight the old wars, but they don't have the wherewithal to change their plans and fight the new wars. And as that happens, our risk of cancer and other things go up. And it happens for all of us as we age. Sorry. But what we were interested in is what's happening with these kids. And there's another instance of what we found. These are teens, and they begin to show evidence of more reduced immune competence and increased immune aging. So that we did cell counts of the types of T cells, and we have your control group and your PI groups, and those are naive, and they don't differ that much in how many naive cells are floating around. We've a little bit more significantly central memory, a little bit more effective memory, but not significant, and definitely more of these terminally um, differentiated cells. Why? Once they get to their families, they're not fighting more diseases. But there's nothing dirtier than a place that has a lot of babies all the time. I'm sorry. Orphanages often have a lot more pathogens. These kids come often are at adoption, have more intestinal parasites. I mean, just a lot of things. And one of the things that they are more likely to have is they're carrying and suppressing the cytomegalovirus. All of us do with aging develop, get in contact with this, but usually not when we're kids. And what we found is that, yep, that was it. Cytomegalovirus controlling this pathogen that you have to constantly keep under control seems to be what was driving the aging of these T cells. There's probably other things as well, but that was the one we were able to get our hands on. So I am going to just come back and say, it's great that we have the social determinants of health. It's great to worry about that all throughout the lifespan, but we got to pay attention to those first few years. And we need to understand how what happens in those first few years interacts with what's happening later, right? And I mean, because so many of the kids who are struggling with ACEs during childhood, who are struggling because they are not being given they're at that point where the social determinants are piling up, have also experienced these early experiences. Now, Barker would say, hey, if life starts out horrid and stays horrid, you're in better shape. Part of the problem for these kids is they got set to one thing and then moved into something else. Maybe that's for you to figure out. I'm retiring. These are all the people who have helped me in all this kind of research. And now I think I've given you a few times for a little bit of questions. And sit down without falling down up here. Hello, my fellow regent.
Hello, it's an honor to have you here. Fascinating talk. I learned so much. Could you say anything about what we know about orphanage conditions, or there must be some heterogeneity.
A lot of heterogeneity, uh, but one dollars and cents matter a lot. So if you have a lot of babies take. I mean, if you have your kid in childcare, you know you pay more for infant care than later because the good care for an infant means maybe 3 babies to one person. No poor country can afford that. So what you end up with is lots of babies to one or two people, right? So maybe 20 babies, two people all the time. And somebody's already always, you know, so they have to routinize everything in most of these places. So you don't get changed when you're wet and dirty. You get changed when it's time to change. And then it's assembly line, and then you get fed assembly line, and da da da. And the folks did the Bucharest study observed and figured out that one-on-one interaction about 5 minutes a day. And those were pretty good orphanages. So it's very difficult, as Mike Rutter said ages ago, to provide in an institutional setting what even just the average family can provide a baby, right? Babies take a lot of hello, babies take a lot of work, even if you have friends who will hold them for you. Um, so that's part of the challenge. There's a lot of variation. Some are cleaner than others. Some have better medical care. Some have better food. But the biggest challenge is expenses. It would cost a fortune. Now, what some places have figured out is that they have people who take care of the babies. They have people who are the gardeners. They have people who are the cooks. They have all these people to run in. What if you took all of them and put them in little homes and broke the babies up into smaller groups so you had more like a family? Hey, same cost. And there are some places that are working that. We have, of course, been publishing, we meaning all of us who do this work, did a whole bunch of things with the Lancet and so on to really advocate, but we've got to figure out how not to warehouse babies and toddlers. They need a different kind of care. Now, by the time your kid is 6 or 7 and you send them off to a very expensive boarding school, maybe that can be okay. I had a cousin whose kids went at high school and she was so horrified, but then she realized it's great. They hate the school, not her. Woo! Piece of cake. And she got about the same amount of quality time with them. So age matters about whether you should be in a group setting or not. But babies, not so much. Babies and toddlers. Yeah. Lots of hands now. The boss guy should probably get to go first.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting talk. I was struck by the effect size of of maybe not actually experiencing anything too bad. How much is it possible that racial discrimination could be operating? And I didn't think of this until you mentioned Garrison Keillor.
Worry about that a lot.
Okay.
So many of these kids are the product of transracial adoption. And we have looked at that. Yes, their reports of discrimination are related to sort of the sleep quality and some other things. But many of them are from Russia and Eastern Europe, and they're white. And those kids are in worse shape than the Asian kids, actually, because Asian kids had a genetic defect. They had 2X chromosomes, which is why they ended up in an orphanage. And the kids from Russia may have had other reasons why they were abandoned, and the quality of that care is often not as good as in other places. So it's certainly part of the story. And Rich has done beautiful work showing that the kids whose parents recognize that they have become biracial, they become a transracial family, and really work hard to educate themselves on what their kids might be experiencing, and really work hard to be open to their child, talking to them about it, and so on, do much better. Color blindness is the kiss of death for these kids. Kids who are adopted internationally into homes with trans parents actually do pretty well, because the trans parents already understand what it's like to be discriminated against and are sensitive to that issue with their kids. So being sensitive to discrimination is critically important if you're going to, adopt kids from who are different than your past experiences. That happened in this country too. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. This is just like amazing stuff. And just so you know, I was one of the lab school kids, and my mom says I was probably one of the few kids who didn't speak English at that time, because this is a long time ago.
That a bit?
Mid 60s.
I wasn't there yet.
Yep, you were. I know. I was gonna say.
Do my spit test.
Yep, I was gonna say you weren't there yet, but my mom thinks that someone wrote me up because I was probably one of the few kids who did not speak English. So anyway, that's a total.
Did they do well by you? I hope they did.
I can't remember. Can't remember. I have a photograph of myself with my mom thought it was a good idea that instead of telling me she was leaving, she would just quietly leave and then she would disappear. I know, I have kids. I know that's not a good thing. I know.
I don't want to disrupt them.
Right.
And then you'd look up and you go, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right. So there's
a foot. Ever coming back?
There's this photograph of me with my mouth wide open, screaming. Okay. Anyway, So I was curious because you were talking about how the early years are so important. Do you have any idea of how early?
Is
Are we
early.
talking 6 months, 1 year, one and a
That's
half?
really interesting. As I do, I can answer that question because they're in Canada. They did a study of Romanian adopted kids, and some of them got to their families by 6 months, their Canadian families by 6 months of age. No evidence of any difference from any other kids, even though they had been in Ceausescu's Romanian horrible deprived orphanages. And that sort of is some of what Rudder was finding in the English one. There is some huge plasticity of the brain. And then as we move on beyond that, something else is going on. And I have not, typically, you don't see kids coming that early unless, I mean, that's rare, especially if they're coming from institutions because there are rules in countries about how long the parent doesn't show up before the child becomes a, it ends up just pushing the adoptions to later. Foster care, yeah, we saw a lot of kids from foster care in the Korean foster care era that were getting their families by 3 or 4 months. And I mean, those kids look, I mean, cognitively horrific. And then they had the issue of, dealing with being a minority and all that kind of stuff, but cognitively, terrific. None of these attention problems. Yeah, we don't.
At the
Any
end,
kid can have those, right? Yeah, all right.
sorry. At the end there, you related this to the Barker hypothesis. Could you just say a little bit more about what you were thinking there? Because I didn't quite catch everything you were saying. Yeah.
About the Barker hypothesis. He was a fabulous epidemiologist. You guys know? Yeah, you've heard that name. And he was studying, using data from the Scandinavian countries that collect everything, and was looking at the, evidence of heart disease and so on. And he noticed that birth weight seemed to be an important predictor of. And his argument was that there was you get the elevated blood pressure, et cetera, because your nephrons are smaller and you're sort of programmed for sort of a different but then he began to argue, and others thought about, well, maybe the issue is that you're adapting to a harsh, deprived context, and this is anticipatory of what the world's going to be like. So what your mother gets to eat, how harsh things are, that information gets to you in utero, and it's sort of you begin to prep the body for the nature of the world out there, which makes a lot of sense if you don't live that long, because the environment may not change that much. But their argument was, well, maybe then if you come out and the world is harsh and you're programmed to be able to put on a lot of fat very quickly if there's any calories and store it away and blah, blah, works great if you live in a very low resource area. But when you come out and live suddenly in McDonald's land, you are both motivated to eat more McDonald's and you are motivated to put that fat to your gut more. And so you're going to have a worse problem than individuals who were not experiencing that deprivation. So that's the hypothesis about switching. Again, really tricky to get the right data to really prove that. And certainly it doesn't look that way for social and emotional relationships. You are better off getting a good parent at any point in development. It will enhance your functioning. So it may have more to do with nutrition. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Great. I was really interested in your slide with the Romanian children and the spit samples because you had a comparison group of kids from the same birth country. I was wondering if you could comment on like the availability of that kind of comparison or any patterns of results with respect to comparing the adoptees with the birth country.
The Bucharest guys do. They, the guys who did the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, their comparison group were Bucharest kids, never institutionalized. They did not collect saliva, or they did, but then it wasn't acid and analyzed light. Oh yeah, I guess I do. Hello, got that study. I did show you the diurnal one. How did I get that sample? We arranged with a childcare center to be able to go over and do what I did in our childcare center here, which is play the tasting game and collect spit from all the kids in that center over multiple days at different times of day. And parents agreed to it. So That's how I got it. It's very hard to get a within country. Blue Cross people do have the within country comparison.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gunnar. And let's give her a round of applause.